All right, hello everybody, welcome. So we are here in CLS 4200, right? This is actually Chicanx-Latinx, History of California. And what you're gonna see today are wonderful presentations by students, right? Providing different kinds of perspectives and viewpoints, right? And experiences of what they see as important, right? What we need to know regarding the experiences happening in California. And so we have 5 groups that are going to be presenting different works, including oral histories, testimonials, also different cultural products are going to be presented, right, etc. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and move forward with Indigenous Latin America. Let's give them what snaps and applause and all that good stuff. Welcome.
Hello everyone, and thank you for being here today as we share our final project with a focus on oppression and appreciation of Indigenous, Mexican, and Latin American peoples. I will begin this project as I discuss the topic of colorism and anti-indigeneity within the Latinx community. In the article, Colorism and the U.S. Immigration Consideration for Researchers, Monroe and Hall define colorism to be prejudicial and preferential treatment of same-race people based solely on their color. The reason why colorism is a form of anti-indigeneity is because of the history of white supremacy during colonization. The obsession of white ideology and purity refuses to acknowledge any other culture, tradition, or language. In the article, 14 Examples of White Privilege in Latinx Community, Lubrio uses the strong quote of white lifestyle as a way to mejorar la raza. It is important to acknowledge how white Latinx folks have privilege over darker Latinx people or indigenous folk, because acknowledging that it exists will allow us, as a community, to come together and change the focus point that make Indigenous, Mexican, and Latin American people so diverse and wonderful. Latinidad will never thrive if we continue to praise and uplift only whiteness.
Feminicidio is the killing of women that is often condoned if not sponsored by the state or by religious institutions. Many of these women are known as las Inditas del Sur, Indian girls from the south of Mexico, because they all have similar characteristics/backgrounds, being poor, dark-skinned, and indigenous-looking, who have or are more docile and passive than men, but are also submissive, easily trainable, and her body is essential for protection. Who are the aggressors? The aggressors are their spouses/partners, because they suffer from domestic violence, male supremacy, gang members, serial killers, corrupt policemen, and their workplaces like maquiladoras. Many of these women remain silent because they speak their native tongue/dialect. They aren't aware that they have rights because they are scared, they feel shamed or are threatened, and they didn't want to because they love their aggressor and for the lack of justice and protection that the government and police officers lack to give them.
Hi, my slide is on the Purepecha community right here in the Eastern Coachella Valley in Southern California. The Purepecha are an indigenous group from Michoacan, and in the Eastern Coachella Valley, mainly in the Meca, Thermal, and Oasis area, there is a community of several thousand of them. They mostly live in the trailer parks here in the area, some of which are located on the Torres Martinez Indian Reservation. The living conditions here tend to be pretty bad. Sometimes they don't have access to electricity or safe drinking water, and these trailer parks are surrounded by toxic waste dumps. They are considered to be the poorest community in an area that is already pretty poor. Most of them, the men and the women, are farm workers in the local fields. Many do not speak English or Spanish. Instead, they speak their Purepecha language. And there is a history of them experiencing racism here at the hands of the local Mexican population, often being called racial slurs. And they are also economically exploited by the mainly Anglo-American farm companies and the Native American landlords. Although there is a history of the Purepecha going on strike in the fields to try to improve their working conditions. They still practice their traditional festivals in the area in the local church of Mecca, and they have a pretty visible presence in the area. Okay, thank you for your time. Take care.
Hello, I'm Vanessa, and my chosen topic is the South Central Farm and how this community space promoted food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is described as a belief that all peoples have a right to define food and agricultural policies. When the LA Regional Food Bank ordered to close this farm in 2003, courageous indigenous Chicana and Latina women, many of whom were undocumented and low income, stood up to be the leading organizers to resist the closure. They even combated machismo that occurred in the farm itself by creating a section for women to grow what they choose instead of their husbands. This 14-acre land, located on 41st and Alameda in South Central, was nurtured by 350 families beginning in 1992 until 2006. We see this farm as a structure of resistance because they promoted the idea that we have the agency to decide how and what food we should consume, instead of food corporations deciding. Farmers preserved seeds that were passed down generations and grew traditional medicinal plants while creating a sense of community. Children had a place to play safely, and elders had a place to feel needed. In their most productive time, they were able to feed about 3,000 low-income families locally. This farm exemplifies that connection to land is important to build collectivity and serves as a model of resistance and food sovereignty in our history as Latinos, Chicanos, and Indigenous people in California. For more info, please visit their Instagram and website.
I will be talking about the Oaxacan and Zapotec people in California. The Oaxacan and Zapotec people were first seen immigrating into the U.S. during the Bracero era. Through the program, the influx of indigenous Oaxacans and Zapotecs started to become more heavy during the 70s. Both of these indigenous groups seem to have very high rates of poverty, no health insurance, and low quality housing conditions. Indigenous Oaxacans working in agriculture appear to earn even less than their urban counterparts. Kreseki, page 2. Many speak little or no Spanish, making traditional outreach challenging. Many of these indigenous immigrants have low levels of literacy and education and are often poorer than their non-indigenous counterparts.
Hi everyone, my name is Rick, and in my slide I will be discussing curandismo. What is curandismo? Curandismo is the practice of healing to bring the soul back to the body and restore balance. It comprises the use of dancing, herbs, chanting, or a mixed variety. Its exact origins is unknown, but what we do know is that it dates back to the Aztecs, Incans, and Mayans, where it is a very common practice. This practice has been passed down verbally, usually to family or within a small community. The reason for this is because of the destruction caused by the Spanish conquest. Next, I will discuss what curandismo is not. Witchcraft. This word is commonly used by the Spanish Inquisition, which is inappropriate. Occultism. It is not esoteric by nature. Now again, its practice was destroyed, and even as of today, it is still in recovering. Folk medicine. While understandably mistaken, this puts curandismo under a filter from an Old English word, which is widely incorrect. As Avila puts it, we must learn to interpret curandismo as diverse type of medicine, not as invasive or a dangerous practice as we have grown to understand so far. As we embrace curandismo, we will learn to see the world differently and restore balance to ourselves.
Hello everyone, this is Claudia Cepeda, and for this part of the presentation, we will go over the oral histories my peers and I presented earlier in the semester. I interviewed my mother, Maria Segura, to uplift the story of a single migrant mother of a son with severe autism. Brianna interviewed her grandmother, Milagro Fuentes Flores, who shared her story on the struggles of mother-child separation when migrating to the US while escaping poverty and war in El Salvador. Vanessa interviewed her father, Ramon Campuzano, who shared his story of migration to Los Angeles in the 1980s with the goal of providing financial security for his family back in Durango, Mexico. Paola interviewed her uncle, Victor Carranza, who shared his experiences of dealing with discrimination in judicial courts due to his ethnicity and gender. Guadalupe interviewed her father, Jose Meneses, about growing up in poverty and his migration to the US, where he was able to fulfill his American dream. Mario interviewed his mother, Claudia Salazar, who shared her experiences of migration while being undocumented in the United States. Victor interviewed both his father and mother, Victor Manuel Chay de Retamosa and Maria Magdalena Chay de Reyes, both immigrants from Mexico who worked in the agricultural fields of Eastern Coachella Valley and took part in the organization of the United Farm Workers and the strikes here during the 1970s. Lastly, Rick interviewed his classmate and friend Megan Amaral, who shared her story of how education is suppressing people of color and questioning the education system while being ostracized by that same system. Thank you.
Saludos, clase. I will be going over the cultural product slide, and through this cultural product, we hope to connect to the oral traditions of indigeneity in Latin America. Oral traditions is a language and a field of study that derives from Latin American studies, feminist studies, and indigenous studies. Here we hope to show our different identities and to show that through oral traditions, people have a lot of unique and different knowledge to share. The question that we will be answering today is, what does your education at Cal State LA mean to you as a student of Latinx background?
Tú nos dices que debemos sentarnos, pero las ideas solo pueden levantarnos, caminar, recorrer, no rendirse ni retroceder, ver, aprender como esponja, absorber. Nadie sobre todos, faltan todos, suman todos para todos, todo para nosotros. Soñamos en grande que se caiga el imperio, lo gritamos algo, no queda más remedio. Esto no es utopía, es alegre rebeldía del baile de los que sobran de la danza tuya mía. Levantarnos para de eso llevar. Ni África ni América Latina se suba. Con barro, con casco, con lápiz a patear el fiasco. Provocar un social terremoto en escucharte. Venezuela, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mozambique, Costa Rica, Camerún, Congo, Cuba, Somalia, México, República Dominicana, Tanzania, fuera Yankee.
Wow, beautiful, beautiful. Let's give snaps and applause and all that stuff. Wonderful, wonderful work. I mean, just incredible research, right? Talking about the indigenous pieces in California, right? And I know that it's not all, but it's wonderful. And that last cultural piece was just, I mean, astounding. I hope you folks are going to submit that microdoc to our archives, right? Please consider it. All right, let's go ahead and move to our Indigenous American Indian, California Indian group. Welcome.
Okay, so we are the Indigenous American Indian California Indian group. I am Zoe.
I am Raquel Flores.
I'm Alexis Hernandez.
Melissa Millán.
I'm
Emily Lopez.
I'm Julian Enriquez.
I'm Itzel Aguilar.
The first slide is Tongva history. So the LA Basin was home to the Gabrielino Tongva people. By 1769, 10,000 people were already living in the basin and on its islands. Tongva villages were settled across a 1,500 square mile stretch from islands to desert. Most Tongva villages settled around the rivers, creeks, and tributaries that go through the basin. Between 1769 and 1771, a troop of Spanish priests traversed through Tongva territory in search for a site to build a mission. In the summer of 1771, a fourth mission was established in Tongva territory, Mission San Gabriel. Conflict arose between the Tongva and the Spanish priests and soldiers, which led many Tongva villages to pack up and move away and establish villages in other areas of the basin. Those who remained near the mission found it difficult to live with and without the mission. By the end of 1771, San Gabriel Mission was a fixed outpost for the Spanish in the Tongva Basin. By 1785, many people from the villages across the basin were living at the mission. At the mission, the priests required native people to adopt a new way of life, and by 1785, priests had baptized 1,200 natives at the San Gabriel Mission.
Tongva culture. Tongva people sheltered off the coast inhabited most of the Santa Barbara Islands. They lived in the main part of the lowland of Southern California. Villages were located in 4 major ecological zones: interior mountains and foothills, grassland and oak woodland, sheltered coastal canyons, and the exposed coast. Each village had different flora and fauna. Flora is all plant life, fauna is all animal life. Plants and animals and earth materials became important for them because they used it for various purposes, including for food and materials. Prominent flora includes oak and willow trees, chia, cattail, jimson weed, white sage, Mexican elderberry, wild tobacco, and yucca. Prominent fauna includes mule deer, pronghorn, black bear, grizzly bear, black-tailed jackrabbit, cottontail, bald eagle, dolphin, and gray whale. The villages in Santa Catalina Islands and San Nicolas built planked canoes and traded rich marine resources with mainland villages and tribes. Shoreline communities traded rich animal and faunal life of ocean, bays, and wetland environments. Interior tribes had an environment rich in Sonoran life zone, including rabbit, deer, acorn, seeds, and native grasses. At higher elevations, desert bighorn sheep were hunted. Within the villages, they would gather flora and fauna and would trade with each other for their resources. Tongva territory became the center of the trade network. They had trade relations with the Cahuilla, Serrano, Luiseño, Chumash, and Mojave. Tongva was the most culturally advanced group and wealthiest. This led to the Tongva people dominating other native groups.
Hi, I'm Alondra, and my part was on gender roles. Gender roles are socially constructed behaviors that are assigned to a person depending on their sex and gender. Women tend to have more home-oriented and nurturing behaviors, while the men have more active and worldly behaviors. We see this in many cultures, and the Tongva people did not shy away from it either. Gender roles in their culture consisted of men hunting, while women would do most of the gathering and cooking. The boys of the culture were taught to build things such as boats or arrowheads by their fathers or other men in the community, sorry. The girls were trained by the elders about the land and the resources they could find within their community. Their mothers also taught them how to weave the baskets that they used to hold babies, water, or acorns. When it came to outsiders coming into their land, the men would usually prepare to either trade or fight, while the women would gather the young children and flee to somewhere safe. Each person had their own role in the community, but each role was equally as important as the other.
So for Tongva traditions, for their clothing, men and children did not wear a lot of clothing during mild weather. The men would wear animal skin, and the woman will wear skirts made of thin strips of bark, tall grasses, or leather. And during the colder seasons, everyone will wear capes made of animal fur. And for food, they would eat seafood like kelp, shark, shellfish, and clams. They would catch the fish by nets or on lines with hooks made of bone or shell. And on land, they would also hunt squirrel, rabbit, and deer meat with boomerangs, which what they called macanas, and bows and arrows. Women would also gather acorns, kettles, and chia plants to make cake. And they would also get berries, nuts, seeds, fruits, and honey. Next slide. So for trade, they would trade steatite. They use steatite to carve bowls, beads, fish hooks, shovels, and smoking pipes. They traded steatite with other tribes in the region, and they also traded seeds, fish, furs, and animal skins. And for their religion, they believed in a religion named after the creator, Chicanx-Latinx. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Women and men could be shamans, which are religious leaders and healers of the tribe. They believe that they had special powers to heal the sick and can shape shift into an animal.
Hi, I'm Alexis, and I'm going to be talking about the current issues that the Tongva tribe goes through. So although the Tongva tribe has recognition from the state, they're still trying to gain federal recognition. And the difference between the two is that the state recognition is basically just recognizing that they are an existing tribe, while the federal recognition would be that they're recognizing and acknowledging their rights as a tribe. And the Tongva tribe is being forgotten because the recognition is so low. When new generations come, the education of the Tongva tribe begins to fade. And to gain recognition, the Tongva tribe must pay for an attorney they cannot afford. And with that stress, they have disputes within the tribe, and sometimes even some of their people will leave the tribe. And the Tongva tribe won't let that stop them. They speak out at events or to students in different classrooms because they want to be remembered and acknowledged for what they have done for the communities.
Hello, my name is Emily Lopez, and for my slides, I wanted to highlight some Tongva people today. So I found two artists with Tongva ancestry, and the first one here is River Garza, and he grew up in Gardena, California, and his work is really reflected on his Tongva identity and modern societal issues. So here on the right, there is a couple of his artwork. Next slide. And then similarly, there's artist Kelly Caballero, who is a poet and songwriter. And she has, here I have inserted two of her performances, but because of time, I won't be able to play either one of them. But this is some of her, two of her pieces. It's pretty much like spoken poetry. Next slide. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight a children's show which recently aired on Netflix called City of Ghosts, where each episode, a group of children visit different cities in Los Angeles and learn about its history. One of the episodes is dedicated to the Tongva people, and they spend the whole episode learning about the history of Indigenous people of Los Angeles.
For our oral history projects, I decided to keep my group members' own words on the slide because they chose and interviewed people that they all care about in their lives. So I, Zoe, wrote about my childhood best friend, Gabby. I wrote about her because she grew up much more privileged than most children of Mexican immigrants. Alondra wrote about her mother, who is an immigrant from Mexico and has accomplished a lot in the US. Itzel wrote about her dad, who is an immigrant from El Salvador and arrived at the age of 13. Julio wrote about his mother, who immigrated from El Salvador, and he spoke on her journey of crossing the border. Alexis wrote about her grandmother, who gave her family a lot of opportunities in the US. Emily wrote about her grandmother, who immigrated from Mexico. She spoke on her struggles of being an immigrant and how the Los Angeles community really helped out her grandmother. Melissa wrote about her dad, who was an immigrant from Mexico. She wrote about the experiences of her dad becoming a US citizen. And lastly, Raquel wrote about her mother, who was an immigrant from Mexico. She spoke on the struggles of her mom building a life in Los Angeles.
I did this piece as a spoken word. I did it in the historical aspect of the Tongva people and also the prominent figure Toy Peruna and what the legacy she has left behind and the meaning to be resilient. And also in doing some research, I was able to find murals of her from El Monte, even to my hometown here in Pacoima.
Resistance. The Tongva Nation have lived in this nation over 7,000 years. More than 10,000 people have lived on this coast. Their prized possession was trees and parcels, but it was not gold. As many as 60 different tribes live on this coast. But in 1542, we see some ships just roaming around. It wasn't until 1769 these savages called the Spanish came here to stay. They came to rape, snatch our children, and create bloodshed. Now we must resist. 24-year-old Toy Peruna gathered soldiers from 8 different villages and decided to fight back. Their battle was profound, but it was lost, but her name was not. We must be Toy Peruna. Resist is what she did. We must be Toy Peruna. Protect California from racism, police brutality, and care of the land that we stand and breathe from. Toy Peruna and the Tongva Nation will not be forgotten.
All right, thank you.
Wow, wonderful snaps. That was just beautiful. Thank you. Applause. Wonderful, wonderful piece. Thank you. Thank you to this group. Really appreciate it. Very not beyond informative, right, folks? I mean, we're just learning so many different aspects of folks, and I love the contemporary part of it, right? That it's not like we're studying the subject of Tongva like they're like in the past, right? These are folks that are living members, they're part of our communities, they're active, right? Active agents and whatnot. So thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. And I, again, Julio, you might want to submit that piece because that's a testimonial too, right? For the Microdoc archive, just putting it out there. Think about it too. We'll talk more after class. All right, let's go ahead and move now to our next group, which is the Californios-colonial settlers perspective experiences. So welcome.
Hello, today we'll be presenting on Californios-colonial settlers.
Hi, I'm Natalie.
I'm Christina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carmen.
Hi, I'm Adrian.
My name is Eloisa.
Hi, I'm Juan.
And I'm Giovanna.
To start off our presentation, we'll be going over a brief summary in history. So Californios were people native to California since the 16th century. California women were an integral part of society. They were involved in politics and business and moved up in social society. Men that were foreigners wanted to immerse themselves in the Californian societal hierarchy, so they often married Californian women and learned Spanish, as well as converting to Catholicism. Once California became part of the U.S., prominent Californians fought for their rights as it was starting to be taken away by the American government. Now I will pass it on to Natalie.
Pio Pico was born on May 5th, 1801, and died September 11th, 1894, and was of African, Indian, and Spanish descent. He was a California politician, ranchero, and merchant, and was the last governor of Alta California under Mexican rule, governing briefly in 1832 and from March 1845 to July 1846. He was horrified at the growing rates of American immigrants coming to California. There were laws that threatened deportation if American immigrants refused to adopt Mexican citizenship and converting to Catholicism. He tried to negotiate annexation by a European power, but was opposed by Mariano Vallejo. His fear came to life in 1846 when the American troops invaded California, which resulted him in deciding to flee to the south. He sold 12 million acres of public land, which includes Catalina Island, at low rates in order to raise money for the war and keep as much land as he could out of reach to Americans. In 1848, Mexico ceded Alta California to the U.S., and he then returned back home to Los Angeles. Once returned, he lived as a hotel owner, rancher, private citizen, businessman, and was a Los Angeles city councilman. Today, we see some of his buildings like Pico House and El Ranchito, and now I will pass it down to Joanna.
Women in the colonial North. So during this time, Californians were typically married to wealthy men who owned land like haciendas or ranchos, or they were the wives of soldiers. Californianas that came from wealthy families had servants and worked alongside them in and out of the house. For example, Maria Higuera Juarez, there's a picture of her on the right, owned a rancho and worked alongside her servants. She cooked, cleaned, washed, gathered herbs, and raised children. Someone who owned an hacienda would have had more servants and help, but they would have worked as well. One other thing they did was protect the land while their husbands were away. A story of Maria Higuera Juarez is known for arming herself. She's known for arming herself with a spear and protecting her land when Anglo invaders tried attacking the rancho. The wives of soldiers typically followed the men when they went to battle. They would set up as well as protect the camps. They cooked, they cleaned, they nursed the wounded, and raised children. And although they weren't Californianas, indigenous women were very much present. They were exploited on the missions and haciendas, and their land was constantly taken away from them. Unfortunately, regardless of their status, women could not escape the violence that surrounded them. Now I will pass it on to Juan.
For the bear flag incident, we have 4 characters we want to keep in mind. They are John Sutter, John Marsh, John C. Fremont, and Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, the last of which was appointed military command by the Mexican government in order to keep the Northern California for them. Prior to 1840, there was almost no Euro-American immigrants in Alta California. Then in the early 1840s, immigrants began traveling overland from Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky into northern Mexico. This was as a result of one of the characters that we talked about earlier, which was John Sutter, who published in the newspapers, primarily the newspapers from Missouri, that they should come over, the Euro immigrants should come over and basically take over the land that, for Manifest Destiny's belief, was theirs. The other individual, John Marsh, also followed suit, and it was during the caravan of 1841, which he traveled with a party, and which was from a response to also one of Marsh's letters. And we have John Fremont, who was the main intruder, the main insurrectionist. He had his troops think about possibly removing Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo from his position and take over the land. The reason that some of these Euro-Americans wanted to turn over someone like Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo after he has housed them and like nurtured them because they were coming from these places. The reason for that was that there was an incident that happened where these Euro-Americans were stripped away from the little that they had, and eventually they were frustrated and they turned against Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. And for that reason, they got rid of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, and then they proceeded to Sonoma and placed Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo under arrest. Another thing that happened during this incident is that there was also two brothers who raped indigenous women. And these brothers arrived from Missouri in 1841, and they were known as the Kelsey brothers. And now I will pass it on to Christina.
Oral history. And oral history gives an opportunity to an individual to be able to learn about the story of other individuals. This gives the individual an opportunity to be able to build a connection and hear a little bit more of the life obstacles the individual has had to go through, in which it will help an individual have a better understanding of the experiences that the individual has had to overcome. We'll be sharing a little piece of background information that we learned through our oral histories. I interviewed my mom, Blanca Y. Castellon. She was born in Los Angeles, California, and was raised primarily in Los Angeles. During her early years in her childhood, her and her family moved quite often because of financial reasons. After she graduated high school, she couldn't continue her education because she had to work and to be able to help her parents financially support her younger sisters through school. Our colleaga Giovanna interviewed her mom, Amelina Barriesa. She was born in Durango, Mexico, and first crossed over to the U.S. when she was 15, and has only lived in East Los Angeles for 35 years. As an immigrant woman and mother of 4, she faces a lot of hardships but continues to be resilient. Natalie interviewed her grandpa, Jose Montoya. He was born in Aclaclan, Nayarit, Mexico, crossed over alone at the age of 19 and worked for the Union Pacific Railroads for a majority of his life in the U.S. He faces a lot of hardships crossing over into the U.S. Juan interviewed Ivan Hernandez, a good friend of his. Ivan is a Chicano who was born in the city of La Mirada, California, and grew up in the city of Pasadena, California. His family's history originates from Michoacan, Mexico. Ivan and his twin sister were born to a mother who did not hesitate to migrate to the U.S. in search of a better future as a single parent. Our colega Carmen interviewed her mother, Fabiola Jimenez. She was born and raised in Jalisco, Mexico. A year after having her first daughter, Fabiola, she decided to migrate to the U.S. to provide a better future for her. After many attempts to crossing the border, Fabiola was finally able to reunite with her daughter in Los Angeles, California. Eloisa, our colega, interviewed her brother, Anabel Paredes, who was also born in Mexico City. He came along with his parents, crossing the border in search for a better life. He was raised in LA since he was 5 years old. He was unable to continue his education because of the pressure to work and because there was no set future for him because he is an immigrant. Adrian interviewed his friend Ricardo Solis Cuevas. He is a Chicano who was born and raised in Pasadena, California. Growing up, he faced many hardships that immigrant families face. He did not have the same access to resources that the others had. He had to work while attending school to help his family financially, and he struggled with how he identified with his roots as a Chicano in society. I'll be passing it along to my colegas Adrian and Carmen.
The first meme is meant to depict the opposite effect that Californios had on the indigenous people and their society. The indigenous people were subjected to many forms of violence by Californio soldiers and priests. Their families were also enslaved and sent to missions far from their homes. The second meme is meant to depict the origins of the bear flag incident. John Fremont was given permission to cross through California after he stated that he and his men were looking for a route to the Pacific. However, Fremont began to incite the Euro-American immigrants. Fremont increased tensions amongst the Californios and the Euro-American immigrants, which led to the creation of the Osos and the bear flag incident.
So the third meme depicts the history of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which happened on February 2nd, 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a peace treaty which ended the war between the U.S. and Mexico. It was signed in El Valle de Guadalupe Hidalgo. This historical document set boundaries between the two nations, mostly in favor of the U.S., transferring Mexico territories to the U.S. in exchange for $15 million. The present day states that were included in the land transfer were California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Though the treaty was a peace document between Mexico and U.S., civil and property rights of Mexican and and Indians were evaluated and interpreted in the favor of westernward expansion of the U.S. Mexicans who lived in these nearly acquired American territories were given the option to stay or leave the land. The majority of these Mexicans decided to stay, and they were granted U.S. citizenship. These people were given 1 year to elect their preference of citizenship. If a decision was not made, the people would become U.S. citizens as default. Though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the U.S. and Mexican War, the U.S. failed to meet the obligations under the treaty. Some of the ways in which Mexicans and Indians were affected by this were the California Indian tribes were stripped from the rights stated in the treaty. They were the victims of murder, slavery, thief of property, and hunger. Indian population had declined by over 100,000 in 2 decades. Whites overran tribal lands and exterminated Native Indians. In 1824, Indians were considered Mexican citizens under the Mexican Constitution. However, upon the transfer of the territories, they were denied both U.S. citizenship and protection. Citizenship rights were not the only thing that the U.S. government violated. The treaty also involved the safety and respect of the existing property rights for Mexican landowners living in the transferred territories, which of course the U.S. government also failed to provide. The majority of Mexican landowners lost their lands due to the U.S. extreme increase in expenses. Mexican landowners in the transferred territories were basically obligated to sell their properties at half its value.
That is the end of our presentation. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Let's give snaps, claps, all that good stuff, applause. Thank you so much. Very informative, wonderful pieces. I mean, I really love the memes and the way that everything came together. Thank you so much. And let's move to our next group, which is the Braceros.
Braceros by Ana Canela,
Viviana Carranza,
Karen Escobar,
Adriana Landros,
Alejandra Marquez,
Maritza Rodarte,
Sandra Villalobos.
Outline. Introduction, History of Braceros, Who were the Braceros, Resistance and Empowerment, Cultural Peace, Impact of California, Personal Connections, Oral History Assignments, Conclusion. Introduction. A bracero is a manual laborer or one who works using his arms. The Bracero program allowed millions of Mexican men to come to the United States to work on primarily agricultural labor contracts. The Bracero program was initiated in August 1942. Hiring of braceros as temporary laborers added tension within Citra's workforces and communities.
History of Braceros. Initiated on August 4, 1942, the Bracero program was a joint program under the State Department, Department of Labor, and the Immigration and Naturalization Services in the Department of Justice. This program allowed for the importation of laborers primarily in the agricultural economy on short-term labor contracts. Because these laborers were still undocumented, they could not contest their low wages nor their working or living conditions, making them ideal for exploitation. In a world of its own, they explain, growers preferred women for packing house labor and braceros or undocumented aliens for picking jobs due to their compromised positions in systems external to the workplace. The program ultimately ended on December 31st, 1964, after heavy debate and criticism, as well as the movement towards mechanization in the agroeconomy.
Who were the braceros? Undocumented workers who came to the United States to harvest crops throughout the
West and Midwest in 1942. They were permitted to work in the United States as a solution to help labor needs during the World War II. They worked in packing houses, railroads, and fields. Braceros faced wage discrimination and they were getting paid less than what their contract stated. Matt Garcia's A World of Its Own states, for example, among the 24 states involved between 1943 and 1947, California drew an average of 54% of the total braceros that came to the United States. These numbers continued to grow in the post-war period, increasing to 456,000 by 1957, well above the wartime high of 76,184 in 1943.
Resistance and empowerment. For many braceros, their temporary time working in the Southwest generated unkind and strong feelings of resentment among Citrus-colonial residents. They had to endure being called certain names like scabs. Braceros also made less than what they were told they would be earning. In Matt Garcia's book, A World of Its Own, he states the following. In practice, braceros routinely earned less than what their contracts promised, but more than what they received for the same work in Mexico. Braceros really had to endure a lot while working in the US, and that really showed their strength and resilience during that time. Along with braceros, Mexican married women also showed resistance by breaking tradition and started working as well. They did not comply to the typical standards and entered the workforce to also help support their families during difficult times.
Impact of California. California growers constantly attracted the highest number of braceros of all the states participating in the program. For example, out of the 24 states that participated in the program between 1943 and 1947, California represented an average of 54% of the total braceros that came to the United States. Even if at the time a total of about 200,000 Mexican Americans were already working the fields of Southern California. As a result, the Bracero program created inter-ethnic hostility between Braceros and Mexican Americans. Unlike the Braceros, Mexican Americans did not have guaranteed job security. They were displaced and replaced by Braceros. As Mexican Americans lost their jobs to Braceros, they also encountered racial segregation and marginalization.
So for personal connections, I have a connection because three of my great-grandfathers were braceros, and I decided to interview one of them, and his name is Jesus Gomez. He said he had really bad experiences as a bracero, and the first time he came to as a bracero, he was 24 years old, and he used to work 8 hours every single day, and he said that he got paid $12 every 2 weeks, and that he had he used to live in la casa de los patrones, as he said, and he also said, no me gustaba el trabajo, pero no tenía otra opción más que aguantarme. And he said that la quincena más grande fue de $25, which he got paid $25 every 2 weeks, which is nothing.
I have a personal connection as well. My grandfather, Angel Castro, he traveled to the US for the first time as a bracero in 1955 with other men that he knew from Zacatecas, Mexico. He worked in Dallas, Imperial Valley, and San Antonio, Texas, in fields picking cotton. He lived in dorm-like facilities called barrancas, and he earned less than 30 cents an hour for his labor.
I interviewed my mom, Norma Martinez, for my oral history project. I thought it would be the perfect time to get to know more of my mom's upbringing, along with a story I wanted to know more on, which was when my mom and her parents got deported and how that whole situation affected them.
I interviewed my father and mother, Eduardo and Yolanda Escobar. Both interviewees reflected the idea of transnational families and migration due to poverty, as well as the prolonged pathways to citizenship.
I interviewed my mother, Maria Isabel O. Canela, for my oral history project. She was the first in her family to migrate to the United States. I wanted to know her experience as a woman working in factories, performing work men typically would be hired to do.
My name is Adriana. I interviewed my grandfather, Francisco Garcia. He talked about his childhood, migration process, and family. I learned how much love he has for Magdalena Sonora and how proud he is of the family he has today.
I'm Maritza Rodarte. I interviewed my father, Baudilio Rodarte, to learn about his journey from Mexico to the United States. He shared his experiences during early life, many of which I wasn't aware of, allowing me to gain knowledge about the struggle.
So I interviewed my great-grandfather, Jesus Gomez, for my oral history project because he was a bracero at a very young age.
Men in the Bracero program were exploited throughout the years of the program's existence between the years 1942 and 1965. In the image at the center of the collage, we can see braceros working in the fields in what looks like hot weather. They also seem tired and like they've had a long day of work. Men in the Bracero program were processed like cattle and were thought to carry diseases and parasites because they were immigrants. This mentality was rooted in xenophobia and eugenics, as Mexicans were thought to be inferior in all aspects. The picture on the bottom right shows braceros being processed. This other image on the top left also shows braceros going through medical examinations and being dusted with DDT upon arrival in the US. Braceros were provided poor living conditions. In some, if not most cases, workers were housed in converted barns or tents without running water or sanitary facilities and slept on canvas beds. Braceros were overcrowded and the close living conditions made them prone to respiratory illnesses. These living conditions clearly display the mistreatment of the braceros. On the bottom left image, we see one of many facilities with closed canvas bunk beds in which braceros stayed. Unfortunately, incidents did occur, and one that was reported took place in 1963, in which a freight train collided with a bus carrying 58 migrant bracero workers. 28 braceros were killed and 25 were injured. Since braceros were identified by number and not by their name, only 12 bodies were able to be identified. On the bottom center is an image of the Salinas, California newspaper article covering the incident. In the top right is an original bracero card issued to an individual named Jesus Campoya in 1951 in El Paso, Texas. At the top center, we find a copy of my grandfather's bracero identification card issued in the year 1955 in Texas. The information on the card is actually not accurate. For example, the date of birth printed on his card is not his actual date of birth, and the home address is spelled incorrectly. My grandfather's identification card compared to that of Jesus Campoya's looks slightly different. His card includes more personal information and what looks like a fingerprint, whereas my grandfather lacks that information. This collage only represents some aspects of the Bracero program.
Conclusion. The history of braceros has been ignored by Mexico and the United States. Once the braceros were no longer needed, they returned to their homelands without any recognition from the US for their contributions. The braceros converted the agricultural fields of America into the most productive in the world. Mexicans were also discriminated throughout the process, as you can see in this slide, the picture. Thank you very much for viewing our presentation on braceros.
All right, wonderful. Let's give snaps, applause, claps, all that good stuff. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful piece. Really love the collage, right? Very, very informative. Thank you so much. And also the personal touch. Thanks for connecting, right? Bringing in, your personal connections to this, to these very important workers, right? Who very much made some major contributions, right? And went through so much. So thank you for helping us to understand that experience more. Let's go ahead and hop into our final group, which is Los Angeles, LA. You're up. Welcome.
Okay, y'all, we're gonna share a little bit of history about LA that we didn't get to spend a lot of time on during the class.
We want to begin with the events of Chavez Ravine and how popular culture paired with racism led to the displacement of hundreds of Mexican American families in LA. Chavez Ravine was made up of 3 neighborhoods, Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop, which were made up of majority Mexican residents. In 1958, after LA voters passed Proposition B, LAPD forcibly arrested and dragged residents from their homes. Proposition B is what gave the land to the Brooklyn Dodgers, who were moving to LA.
Chavez Ravine before becoming Dodger Stadium. Chavez Ravine was a large, independent, semi-rural Mexican-American community in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Many of the families living in Chavez Ravine by the 1950s moved there because of racial housing discrimination within the city of LA. Due to its reputation as a poor, rural area, the neighborhood of Chavez Ravine was viewed as another example of ghetto barrios. In 1951, Chavez Ravine was planned for redevelopment under the National Housing Act of 1949, which provided federal money to build public housing. The LA Housing Authority began acquiring the land of Chavez Ravine in 1951 through both voluntary purchases and the exercise of eminent domain. In the aftermath of the public housing proposal, the city acquired almost all of the land of Chavez Ravine and nearly destroyed the entire community over the period of 1952 to 1953. The city had agreed with the federal government to abandon the public housing project, with the only stipulation that by then, the nearly vacant land be used for public purposes. In 1953, Norris Polson, a political conservative, was elected mayor of Los Angeles. She opposed public housing and saw it as un-American, and did many other business leaders who wanted the land for private development. In addition, a public vote was then passed barring all public housing in Los Angeles, which resulted in the termination of Elysian Park Heights development and affected many low-income Latinos looking for subsidized rent. The Dodgers were eager to be the first team in the West Coast and attract a new fan base, eventually moving in 1958. The Dodgers organization also liked Chavez Ravine due to its close proximity to downtown and its potential with its future endeavors.
This process of violent removal with the intention of erasing what and who previously existed in this space in order to create something new for outsiders can be called many things, and one of those is settler colonialism. Settler colonial projects such as gentrification and policing are informed by racism and classism, among many other isms. And while the violent housing displacement that occurred in Chavez Ravine was especially heinous, these processes continue to happen today, as you can see in the photos featured on the slide. Last November, on Thanksgiving evening, CHP officers hogtied and dragged members of the Reclaim and Rebuild Our Communities organization, including minors, who were reclaiming houses owned by Caltrans that have sat vacant for decades along Sheffield Avenue in El Sereno. This is very much reminiscent of the events at Chavez Ravine. We continue to see settler colonial agencies express their interest of profits over people, as displayed by such actions taken by police in Los Angeles to this very day.
The Zoot Suit riots were violent disputes during which mobs of U.S. servicemen, off-duty police officers, and civilians fought with young Latinos and other minorities in Los Angeles, June of 1943. They were called the Zoot Suit riots from the baggy suits worn by many minority youths during that era, but the violence was more about racial tension than fashion. As the Zoot Suit became more popular among young men in African American, Mexican American, and other minority communities, the clothes garnered a somewhat racial reputation. Latino youths in California, known as pachucos, often wearing flashy zoot suits, pork pie hats, and dangling watch chains, were increasingly viewed by whites as menacing street thugs, gang members, and rebellious juvenile delinquents. Local papers framed the racial attacks as a vigilant response to an immigrant crime wave, and police generally restricted their arrests to the Latinos who fought back. The riots didn't die down until June 8th, when U.S. military personnel were finally prohibited from leaving their barracks. The Los Angeles City Council issued a ban on zoot suits that following day. Amazingly, no one was killed during the week-long riot, but it wasn't the last outburst of zoot suit-related racial violence. Similar incidents took place that same year in cities such as Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit.
Hi, this is Jaditza Ornelas, and from my side, I wanted to focus on the zoot suit itself, mainly on the topics of how it was worn and style back in the day, who wore it first or where did the suit come from, and the threat surrounding the suit. Zoot suits consisted of long coats and pants that were tied around the cuffs and draped around the knees, giving off a dibbling fabric illusion. As we can see from the images, these young men would often style the suits with a fedora, greased up hair, and sometimes a chain attached to their coats. Who wore it first? While we don't know exactly who wore it first or where this suit came from, the zoot suit was known to have developed in the East and became popular in Harlem, New York, where the majority of African Americans would be seen wearing them. The majority who wore zoot suits during the 1940s were Chicanos, Blacks, Italians, and Filipinos. It then made its way to Southern California, where a lot of Mexican youth decided to adopt this look and make it their own as a fashion trend. They were labeled by society as pachucos. The threat surrounding the suit is that slaves believed zoot suiters were guilty of assaults on female relatives of servicemen, which then made them victims to experience abuse by these sailors and also victims of police brutality as they were stripped from their suits just to dehumanize them and often faced the risk of being killed.
Now we're getting into the walkouts of 1968.
The beginning. The walkouts of 1968 consisted of students that were upset about injustice acts happening at their schools. For example, punishment for speaking Spanish and unfair education treatment. Whether they identified themselves as Chicano, Chicana, Latino, Latina, or Mexican American, they were overall fed up with how they were being treated, so the walkouts were something to create a statement. The high schools that were involved in the walkouts were Wilson, Garfield, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Belmont, Venice, and Jefferson. If you grew up in LA, you definitely know these high schools were very impactful and have gone down in Chicano history. The walkouts happened on March 6, 1968 at 10 a.m. But Wilson High School actually walked out March 1st due to a play cancellation that they were extremely upset about. So it kind of threw everything off a little bit. Students from various schools actually helped organize all of the walkouts, not only from the high schools I listed above, but from colleges as well. A few were Cal State LA, Long Beach, and UCLA. The Brown Berets actually were involved as well. If you don't know who the Brown Berets are, they are a Chicano activist group that were founded in 1966 by David Sanchez. They stood up for everything that was Chicano. They were pro-Chicano, and they helped organize many marches, helped with the walkouts, and helped other various pro-Chicano acts during the 60s, which had to do with the Chicano movement. Students from UMass also helped out with the walkouts as well. And during the walkouts, people were arrested, they were detained, forceful acts were used on protesters and their supporters. And it was extremely crazy because I even read that even people that were on the sidelines not doing anything were being given tickets.
We all know or at least heard of the 1968 walkouts. However, in my slide, I talk a little more about what were some of the causes for these walkouts. As we know, immigrants come to America for a better opportunity and to be able to give their children access to a good education. However, as we know, Mexican American students were not given the equal education that they had hoped for. In fact, most of the teachers were not concerned whether or not these students went to college, but instead, these teachers focused that Mexican American students would learn with their hands to prepare them for when they went into the labor workforce. To add on to the unequal education, there was a lot of prejudice and discrimination towards Mexican American students. For example, they would be punished if they had spoken Spanish and not in English, and because of this, Mexican American students received lots of hate. At a point, these students had enough and wanted a better education, and that's how the walkouts came to be.
Salvador B. Castro was born on October 25, 1933. He was a Mexican-American educator and activist. He played a huge role in the 1968 East LA walkouts. He led the walkouts and instilled his students with pride in their Chicano heritage. As an East LA native and as an educator, he was passionate about raising awareness and protesting against the unequal conditions in the LAUSD schools. Sal Castro was jailed for 5 days for protesting along his students. He lost his job but was later rehired after weeks of protesting from the Eastside parents and students. Although the board stated that they could not fulfill the demands of the students due to the lack of funding, the East LA walkouts represented a call to action for civil rights and access to education for Latino youth in the city. It remains as one of the largest student protests in the United States history and a strong commitment to the Chicano identity, which continues to develop until this day.
Our cultural product. The first meme is Chavez Ravine. This historical meme highlights one sports owner's dream to build a stadium and replacing a low-income Mexican community for their own good. The second meme is the Zoot Suit riots. This historical meme shows the Zoot Suit riots as the young Chicanos who were tormented by servicemen and police officers to the point that they were stripped from their clothing in order to dehumanize them. Lastly, we see the walkouts meme. This meme shines lights on the battle of young Mexican Americans faced to pursue equality in their education. They had little to no options. It was either speak up and fight for what's right or settle and follow the path that the system had instilled for us.
And here are our oral histories. So Giselle Samano interviewed her grandfather, who came to the US from El Salvador when he was 13 years old with the help of a missionary who lived in Alhambra, California. Yaritza interviewed her father, who was born and raised in LA during the 1960s, and he's familiar with the East LA walkouts because he witnessed them as a kid. Ricardo interviewed his friend's mother named Maria Hernandez because her story illustrates how she's second generation as her mother migrated to the US from nothing, ultimately facing many challenges to strive for the quote-unquote American dream. Jesus interviewed his father, who was born and raised in San Caja, Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, and he's one of many children who migrated to LA at the age of 22 to get away from poverty. Eduardo Rojas interviewed his cousin Antonio Rojas, who was born in LA and is second-generation Mexican-American. He grew up in South Central and faced a lot of adversity growing up. I'm Yadira, and I interviewed my grandma Griselda Tellechea, who migrated to Turlock, California from Manzanilla, Colima, Mexico in 1963. She moved around Central California with her husband at the time, working in the fields until her pregnant belly was too big for her to work, and eventually found her way to Boyle Heights in East LA, where she still lives today. Yedir Rubalcaba interviewed her mother, Fabiola Ortega, who was born in Colima, Mexico, so maybe we're primas, and migrated to the US when she was 16. She faced many difficulties being an immigrant trying to pursue a better life here in the US. And that's our presentation. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Snaps, applause, claps. I mean, really, really beautiful work. You know, nice pieces when we're looking at LA history. I have to say, every time we talk about Chavez Ravine, like all the Dodger fans just get like all like, I don't know, right? Everybody gets torn. They get torn because they're like, I still want to go to Dodger games despite, right? But there's really this long history, right, of you know, a dark history. We'll just keep it there, right? Because we don't want to turn something ugly. But the reality is that there's a lot of folks that, you know, went through some very dark experiences, right, as a result of that. So thank you to this group for really bringing this forward. And thank you to all of the groups for their beautiful presentations. Very, very informative, right? So much knowledge. I'm so proud of each and every one of you and the pieces that you're bringing forward and you're highlighting, right? As you can see, California is a very diverse place, right? So many different community members, right, that have played a role in the history and the way that it's developed. And so appreciate each and every one of you for your amor and your cariño that you put into these presentations. They really came together very well. So snaps and all that good stuff to each and every one of you. And thank you to those that are watching this piece, right? We appreciate you, you know, tuning in and seeing a little bit about what goes on in CLS 4200. So thank you so much for joining.